to tell you a little bit of Africans in Boston. It's a nonprofit group. I'm representing the group today. Nabil is another member of the team. Our president is still in Chad, but he should be returning shortly. And Africans in Boston started in 2011 and evolved from grassroots community building across national, social, economic, and religious barriers to encompass a broader mission of providing the over 100,000 Africans that live locally in the Boston area. So we represent all parts of Africa, North Africa, West Africa, South Africa, everywhere, all parts of Africa, not just the African continent, but the diaspora, so the Caribbeans, Black African Americans, and most of the times we do have members from Asia, from Latin America that represent. We put on a few events throughout the year. We have a Hakuna Sunday, which is a monthly networker that we do at a Black-owned restaurant to support Black businesses or Latino businesses. And we also do a lot of collaborations with other groups, like we're doing with WARA. Next month, March, we're going to be doing a two-day collaboration with Harvard's Medical School for cancer research in Africa. So if you join our Africans in Boston Facebook page, or you give me your email or you sign up, I'll make sure to pass the information along. So I'm going to pass it to Abil.
Thank you, Joyce. So welcome everyone. I just want to say briefly about WARA, West Africa Research Association. It's headquartered at Boston University. It's a totally autonomous, independent organization of scholars. Among its key missions is to foster the production and dissemination of current research in West Africa, and to promote exchange, academic research, academic exchange among scholars in Africa and other parts of the world, mainly in the US. West Africa Research Association realized its mission mostly through a wide range of programming initiatives, such as conferences, publication, and the research funding. Actually, Donna Patterson, she was one of our postdoctoral fellow back in 2012, right? 2011. So she, perhaps if you want to learn more, we have an insider perspective of what WARA does in terms of promoting research on West Africa. West Africa Research Association also has a subsidiary institution headquartered in Senegal, which is West Africa Research Center. So if you find yourself in West Africa or in Senegal, most probably you may want, and you are engaged in academic research or any type of research, you should definitely contact them, and will provide you with a wide range of services and a network with other scholars with similar interests. I'm not going to talk much about the West Africa Research Association. If you want to learn more, you can always visit our website, which is www.bu.edu/WARA, W-A-R-A, and I encourage you to learn more about it. And if you want to be interested in becoming a member, which I urge you to do. I see there are many students here. The yearly rate for students, it's only $15, and you get a lot of benefit, including being part of this wide network of scholars in the United States, in West Africa, and other parts of the world. Okay? Now I will introduce you very briefly our moderator for the week. Barry Gaither. He's going to moderate the panel today. There is a lot to be said about the Barry Gaither, but I've tried to be as concise as possible, and he told me to be really brief, so I will just follow his suggestion. So he's currently the director and the curator of the Museum of National Center of Afro-American Artists, and is also a special consultant at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. And Barry Gaither has won several awards. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. For instance, the Commonwealth Award for Organizational Leadership, and also has been awarded honorary doctorate in several universities such as Northeastern, Framingham, and Rhode Island College. So I'm just going to pass the word to him, and perhaps you can join me in welcoming the panelists and Barry in particular.
Thank you very much. time is not on our side, so I will try to proceed with great brevity. Here is what I will do. I'll make a brief introductory note on each of the panelists, and I've been allocated a few moments to make what amounts to a preface, a kind of umbrella under which much can fit. Then I will call upon each panelist, and he or she will take the floor, and in some cases use aids, in other cases not. That will be at their discretion. So that is the process that will follow. Just to my left, Dr. Donna Patterson. She is a historian of Africa and the African diaspora with a very particular interest in health-related issues. She holds a PhD from Indiana University, and she has a new book just out, Pharmacy in Senegal, and we want to put in a plug for it. And she will be second, I think, in the presenters. Sylvain, who is at the far end, is professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Brown University. He's also a photographer with some works on exhibition here. He's Haitian by background, and his degrees are from Harvard and University of Massachusetts. He's also an adjunct professor at University of Massachusetts, and he will be the first presenter. And immediately next to me is Bolaji Campbell, who is a professor of the arts of Africa and the African diaspora, and also a specialist on art and visual culture at RISD, just over the way in Providence. He holds a PhD from University of Wisconsin and is Nigerian by birth. So those are your presenters. He will present last. Now, the overarching task is a difficult one, so I'll try to make it as quick as possible. What is African depends on where you're answering the question from. So this is not the same question, and certainly not the same answer if you're on the continent from if you're in the diaspora. If you're in either, there are some elements that will impact the answer. Those are the history of colonial endeavor, engagement, and the history of slavery, and the contestation over control of one's own autonomy. So no matter where you are in the picture, those will be relevant issues. Now, I'm Black American, so I want to shape my next remarks a little bit more for those in the diaspora, in the Americas. I think for us, you could say that Africa and what's African may be presented in three kind of big categories, each of which is worthy of a dissertation. The first category might be the idea of Africa as a point of historical reference. For those of us in the Americas, this is a question of lineage. We exist in an environment dominated by notions of immigrants, with people claiming places. And the issue becomes, what place can you claim? Because if you can't claim a place, it leaves you rootless in this environment. So that point will have secondary to it the need for a sense of place, the search for common locations in historical documents that are known and shared, so that in the Caribbean and in the US, in the 19th century, even in the 18th century, you'll see frequent recourse to identities tied to Ethiopia, to Nubia, to the ancient Nile Valley, because those were locatable in the Bible that everybody knew, and in the classics that were fundamental to education. Also associated with that would be the contestation over naming. This is very revealing. So I just pulled a few of the names that you would have encountered here. When I was a teenager, I found this book published by the Society for the Abolition of the Name Negro. And they had taken on all of these efforts at self-naming. So among the names that you might encounter, Negro, colored, these are in the US context, Afro-American, Afro-American, African-American, so-called Negro, blacks, Negro-Americans, and American Negroes. So, I mean, that tells you a certain confusion exists around this particular endeavor. A second broad category might be Africa as a socio-political reality, as a community of nation states. Now, here we run right away into our political establishment, in which people running for the presidency still think that Africa is a country. So we have under this the recognition of a sense of claiming a participation with continental Africa. Comes to mind that some black Americans went and fought against the Italians in Italy in the 1930s. There was great mobilization to help end apartheid in South Africa. These are around actual places that are actual historical entities and that have specific histories. So that's a really important piece. Also in this would be the internationalization of post-slavery and post-colonial struggles. And at the top of that list would be a set of key figures who have been enormously influential. That would include Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, Patrick Lumumba, Nelson Mandela, just to name a few, but these are figures who are genuinely international in their scope. Also, political organizations that have tried to make a relationship that reaches across the water. That would include certainly the late work of Malcolm X and his engagement at the UN, his late organization of Afro-American Unity. And some of that really belongs to the Cold War and the Cold War framing that covered much of the 20th century. The third and most important category, I think, is Africa as a symbolic legacy. This is really the story of Africa in the imagination. It centers around Africa as spiritual home, Africa as central to cultural identity, and just to flag some ways that you could explore this without doing more than flagging them, I point to the following. In the end of the 18th century, turn of the 19th century, in the US, free blacks identified themselves as African. So the African Methodist Church, founded in Philadelphia at the very end of the 19th century, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, founded a decade later in New York, both took African in their name. In Boston, the meeting house on Beacon Hill, built around 1806, is the African Meeting House. So that's how people chose to reference themselves. Abyssinia Baptist Church is the church from which Adam Clayton Powell Sr. built his political domination in Harlem, and the political force that he passed along to Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Then major early figures like Paul Cuffe. Paul Cuffe is perhaps the first black millionaire in the hemisphere. born right here in Massachusetts, involved in repatriation, left with more than 38 African Americans to take them to repatriate in Sierra Leone in 1815 from Westport in Massachusetts, just right down near the University of Dartmouth. So this idea of reconnecting, of going back, has those early roots. It gets picked up again in Garvey, and is ultimately expressed in Garvey's idea, Africa for Africans at home and abroad, which expressed that same notion. You could pick up another piece of this in the Caribbean in particular with the Rasta movement, which many of us know pretty well. You could, in shifting political alliances, pick up the references in something like the Republic of New Africa, which was a very viable political movement here in the late 80s, or in arts groups that self-named, such as Afracoba, which stood for the African Commune of Relevant Bad Artists, meaning good artists, which was an arts organization, a manifesto arts group created in Chicago at the end of the 60s. You could attach all of this a little bit in the frame with the impact of Festac and that first real reunion across the water with an arts basis. And I'd end by just citing some artists who very early on made it their business to go to Africa and other places in the Caribbean to try to make real this sense of spiritual kinship. I would certainly point out foremost among them John Biggers and Tom Feelings. Tom not only went to work in Africa, but when he left Africa, he went to Guyana. And in both cases, he sought to work for the publishers of school books, so that his images could play that role of mixing things. Kofi Bailey I put in there. And as a final way of closing before passing this along, I would note that Kofi Kaiga, who is a Jamaican artist, some of you may know Kofi, in the first generation of post-colonial artists in Jamaica. He knew from early on that he wanted to be an artist, so he went to study after finishing at the Jamaica School of Art at the Royal Academy in London. And the first thing that the Royal Academy in London made him aware of was how Jamaican he was, and that made him aware of how African Jamaica was. So when he leaves the Royal College of Art, he goes to Makere in Uganda to build on this discovery of himself in a kind of different triangle of reclamation. So I'll let that stand as a preface, and with that, I lay everything over to you.
Well, I might as well just walk out because you've covered covered all the points. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Hello. From Haiti, and one of the things that normally before you start talking, you say hello to everyone who says honneur, and you insert respect. Honneur, respect. So I come in with honor, and you accept it with respect. For me, my connection to sort of the continent, it's a long history. It's one in which Barry and I and a few others were talking about this, was it last week? I find out late in my life that one of my ancestors, Benito Sylvain, was among one of the key founding members of the Pan-Africanist movement, who was key in terms of representing both Ethiopia and Haiti in the Third Pan-Africanist Congress. So in a sense, when I find out who my great-great-grandfather was, I became extremely, could we say, hungry about finding out what exactly is the relationship between the continent of Africa, particularly East and Western Africa, to myself as a Haitian living in the United States, where my skin color, in a sense, is not only a passport to be accepted, but is one in which to be rejected as well. And we could link that from what Barry had said in terms of President Obama. If you are a conservative, if you are a fundamentalist, if you are a racist, let's call it that way, the white side of Barack Obama is systematically denied, killed even. Only the African side remains, and the African side is one in which one must completely reject because his father is Kenyan. And if you're Kenyan, definitely then you must be either A, a terrorist, or B, backward. So therefore, as an African, you cannot be from a so-called civilized society. And we see this play out in terms of conservative politics. Now, as a Haitian, quite often Haitians would say, well, Haiti is indeed the miniature Africa in the New World. Because it was in Haiti that the first blacks arrived in 1503. Now, is it true then that Haiti is the miniature Africa in the New World? Well, if you are a Haitian nationalist, very proud, you will say yes. If you are a pragmatist like me, then you will say no, because Haiti in itself is a contradiction. It's a contradiction in the sense that the way in which we were raised to despise Africa, right? Because we were taught by the French. So anything that was black or Africans was indeed very negative. So in a sense, many Haitians had to redo what we were taught. And my great-great-grandfather, in a sense, by 1889, 1903, and a group of other intellectuals went to Africa in order to defend Ethiopia from the invasion of Italy, and then later on trying to see if indeed they could, in a sense, create a black consciousness throughout the world in order for us to understand what the continent meant. Now, what happened to my great-grandfather? Of course, he was sent back. He was exiled from Haiti because he was seen as being too radical. So in a sense, Haiti, although Haiti became independent in 1804, the history of exile became rooted in the Haitian politics. And we start seeing sort of exile as early as the 1840s. Primarily, most Haitians will move to Jamaica, exile because of coup d'etats, but it wasn't until the early 1900s where Haitians start going back to Africa, trying to understand their negritude. And it was because of the negritude, the connection between some of the Haitians who helped finding the whole notion of negritude, and then later on, Senghor. I wanted to go back to, well, not go back, I wanted to go to Senegal to study the work of Sédar Senghor. And Senghor, to me, still is, although he passed away, one of the preeminent figures of modern democratic West Africa. He was a Christian, elected into position of power by a predominantly Muslim society, modernized you could say the Senegalese institutions, and in a sense created what modern Senegal is today, a very democratic and open society, of course with its problems. And so I wanted to find out more about Senghor. And I also wanted to connect back to what Barry is saying, that historical legacy of where I'm from various places in West Africa, which I don't know exactly. And I wanted to find a place where many of my ancestors came from. So I went to Senegal to look at Gorée, to look at Saint-Louis, to understand the entire crossing. And of course I did something which later on officers from the police in Senegal, and later on the army told me I was foolish, I could have been arrested. I did the crossing from Toubab Jalao to Gorée. And of course, my Senegalese compadres or friends were very much like Haitians in terms of distance. They told me that, well, Gorée is next door, just a few miles away. It's something that Haitians would do. It's just there. So when we took this little boat, of course motorized, I realized that Gorée was a distance between Cambridge to Providence. And we were on that boat with no life jacket. Now, what went to my mind was the distance took us about an hour and a half. What we learned was that Gorée and Saint Louis was most of the major points. And when I went to Senegal, it was not my intention to go to Toubab Dialaw. My intention was to meet this fellow named Gérard Chenet that everyone told me that I must meet. And they said to me, well, he's your countryman. And I'm like, I've never heard of Gérard Chenet. So, well, why is it that as a Haitian, as an intellectual, that I never heard of Gérard Chenet? Because Gérard Chenet was a member of the student movement in 1946 that tried to fight against Haitian dictatorship, was later exiled, went to Canada, then France, and then Moscow and Germany, wound up going to Guinea in the 1950s, and then later on worked, and this is the connection, worked with Senghor. He became a counselor and advisor to Senghor for the arts and literature for 25 years. Went back to Haiti once in 1976, and of course the Duvalier regime, the Duvalier government, killed his brothers and whoever the family members who stayed behind. So here's this Haitian living in Senegal, in Toubab Dialaw, made Toubab Dialaw his home, and everyone told me that I must meet this Haitian fellow who became, in a sense, a Senegalese citizen. Now, why is this extremely important? It's because when he moved to Toubab Dialaw, and by the way, Toubab Dialaw, I find out, Toubab means a foreigner, a white person.
Yeah.
Now, Dialaw, most Senegalese don't know what it means. Well, Dialaw is an old term that means the white catchers are coming. The Toubab Dialaw, white catchers. Because Toubab Dialaw, again, Rufus, which is 25 kilometers away from Toubab Dialaw, Rufus was a processing center. And they would kidnap the slaves, bring them to Toubab Dialaw, where you'll have the boats and sails, and take them to Gorée. So I wind up going to Gorée, in a sense, purely by accident. And what I discovered was that this Toubab Dialaw was a place in which it was developed primarily because of a Haitian who wanted to create what he created in Senegal to create them in Haiti, but he couldn't. And Toubab Dialaw was so distant that, in a sense, Senghor gave them some land, and of course, land at the time was actually very inexpensive. In the 1960s, he developed one of the major cultural centers in part of Senegal, in Toubab Dialaw, where you have spaces for the arts, theater, and so forth. Now, I couldn't show you some of the pictures, but it's worth to Google him. He's a poet, an architect, a lawyer, and also a playwright. Now, and not only that, he was a very well-known swimmer who taught many of the Senegalese how to swim, because like Haitians and other African from the diaspora, we are afraid of the sea. Now, spiritually as well. Now, I will end with the spiritual connection, because one of the things that my Senegalese friends told me was this: it was important for me to make the crossing because it was a form of spiritual cleansing. That I had to make the crossing in order to be in touch with some of the spirits of the sea. In the middle of the crossing, we're seeing all the tankers and everything else. They turn off the engine of the boat. We're bubbling. Yeah? And I'm like, we don't have a lifeboat. And what if those tankers think that we are terrorists? Right? Because I'm thinking of what happened in Somalia and so forth. And we decided to pray for safe passage. So my connection, again, this is a place that is not only very dear to me, but I've learned a lot also about myself, about history, in which the historical book did not have, which was many of the slaves who went to Gorée Island first was crossed in Toubab Dialaw, and over 4,000 of them drowned at sea. Almost no record. It was through the people's history that I find out about it. And also through that history, I found out of a Haitian brother went to exile, went back and found a home in Toubab Jalal, that I made a friend, a connection, and now, in a sense, I'm writing a book about him. So, thank you.
Thank you. My presentation will be slightly different. I have some images, and I'm going to talk mostly about my experiences as a researcher, primarily in Senegal and Ethiopia. We probably won't have time. If so, I'll talk about a few other places. I think I have pictures from 1 or 2 other places. There we go. Okay. So I first went to Africa as a graduate student. I went to Senegal, so Senegal is going to come up again. And Toubab is going to come up again. So I went first as a graduate student. When I was an undergraduate, I studied at the University of Houston. And I studied, my major was history, my minor was African American studies, and I'd taken, I believe, 2 African history courses when I was a student. And I decided that I'd go to graduate school in history, and I decided that I wanted to study Africa because I felt like I had a very strong grounding in African American history, both as a student, but also because I've been self-studying really since high school. And so I wanted to kind of branch out and look at the diaspora in a different way. And so I was narrowing down places, and I decided I was going to study a Francophone country because I wanted to improve my French. So it was a very random reason in some way. And I narrowed it down to Cameroon and Senegal. And I always thought it was going to be Cameroon, but I went to Senegal first, just as a kind of exploratory trip, and Senegal started. And so Senegal, there's a map. Y'all probably don't need a map. There's a map of Senegal, westernmost country on the continent. And so I went to Senegal first in the 90s, mid-1990s. And my first trip, like I said, it was really just to get a sense of, do I want to work in Senegal? And so I went there, I studied Wolof in a very, very intensive way. I studied actually 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. I'd already studied, I believe, 2 semesters as a graduate student, but this was very intense, very intense. And so I did this, so I had this language training, and really I became acclimated in some ways, beginning to become acclimated to the country and the culture of Senegal, because I had been studying Senegal for a while at this point, but I think to go and visit and to live there is very different than reading. I know the history, you read these things, you read these cultural things, but to actually experience them is something very different. And so this was one of the first things I think that I took away from this first trip. And I can't remember, I was trying to remember as I was sitting there how long this first trip was. It was 2 or 3 months, so it wasn't a 2-week trip, so I really went, for an entire summer. So my first experience was really, like I said, getting to know the place. It takes a while. The idea of being there as a foreigner, people would call me Toubab, so they would call me Toubab all the time, which means foreigner, but really means white person in some way. So you're dealing with your identity as an African American, because here you're black. Even if the one drop, whatever you're seen as black, and so people are calling you effectively white person everywhere you go. And so people would call me that sometimes in the street. Kids would love to call me because I would do something that I shouldn't do. And so this is the sort of thing that I experienced. And so, just in the interest of time, I'm going to try to move through this. And so this was one of the earliest things I was seeing. And also, I think too, in getting to know the plays, there's a lot of trial and error. And by the second time I go to Senegal, I seemed to know what I was doing more. I didn't stand out in terms of the way I was moving, this sort of thing. People weren't calling me Toubab, which was great. And so there was definitely a difference in terms of the way people saw me. Now, most of them definitely knew I wasn't Senegalese, but I looked like I should be there. And so I went there a number of subsequent trips as I was thinking about my research and what I wanted to do. I was looking a lot at gender and entrepreneurship, and then I ended up deciding by 1999-2000 that I was going to do a project on female pharmacy owners, which takes me to a few slides. So these are a few pictures of some of the pharmacies that become a part of my research. This is Pharmacy Darabi, which is in a neighborhood, really at the intersection of a few neighborhoods, and very near where the club that used to endure owns, just really down the street. I mean, you can see it from this pharmacy, I'd say. It's very, very close. Here is the interior of a pharmacy that is in downtown, to give you a sense of what those look like. Here's another pharmacy that's downtown, Pharmacy Gambetta. And here is Pharmacy Guigon. Pharmacy Guigon is actually, it's not owned by a Senegalese person, but it's owned by someone who is French. It's been there since 1935. And so, as I said, I made a number of trips to Senegal. The most recent trip that I made to Senegal was actually in 2011 when I did have a WAR fellowship. Actually, I had a WAR fellowship earlier as a student. This was as a faculty member, but as a student, I went to Ghana in 1998. So I've actually had two WAR fellowships. And I found Ghana to be very different than Senegal. I traveled a lot through West Africa. Very different type of experience. Within Senegal itself, I was able to travel over the period of years to different parts of the country, to Sali, to Kaolack, to Saint Louis, definitely to Gorée. I went to Gorée during my first trip. So I was able to travel through the country. Oh, here's another picture of me. Doesn't look good on the screen. This is I forgot it was in here. I wanted to put pictures in the field because I was asked to talk about my experiences in the field. So this is a picture of me at the Senegalese National Archives. Because another major component of my work is not only interviewing people, but also doing archival work as a historian in the archives. And so I think another place that really impacted me, both as a scholar, but as a person, was Ethiopia. And so now I'm working on a second project that is actually on drugs, both legal and illegal, in different countries, and I'm focusing on Senegal, Ethiopia, Cape Verde, and Djibouti. And in terms of Ethiopia, and like I said, Senegal are two major components to that project. So my first trip to Ethiopia was like Senegal. It was an exploratory trip to see what I could do. Would I be able to do this project in the way that I wanted to do in this place? And so in Ethiopia specifically, I was looking at two drugs. Chat, which is a leaf that is chewed, and cannabis, which is marijuana. I'm looking at marijuana too in Senegal and some harder drugs because in Senegal, chat is not consumed. My trips to Ethiopia were very different than a lot of the other places I've been to in some ways. Definitely different than my research in Senegal because of language. Because in Senegal I had Wolof, I had French. English is one of the administrative languages in Ethiopia, but I don't speak Amharic, where I'm studying it now. But I spoke no Amharic when I went there, really nothing. Maybe I could tell you hello. And so in Ethiopia, I relied very heavily on a research assistant to help me in terms of translating certain conversations, translating certain documents. Some of them were in English, others were in Amharic. And so it was a very different experience, where in Senegal I had done everything myself. I had a car at one point, I drove myself around. I was able to communicate people in a different sort of way. And so there was that. Also, I think in terms of being in Ethiopia, because phenotypically I didn't stand out in the way that I had in Senegal. So I was able to walk around in ways, if I was by myself, no one noticed me, which was great. Because when I travel, I think I wasn't going to talk about this, but I think this is a very important point. As an African American traveling in Africa, I often stick out. People often know that I'm not from that space. Sometimes I look like maybe I know where I'm going and I kind of belong in terms of just the way I'm navigating the space, but they know that I'm a foreigner. And they're always asking me where am I from and trying to figure out where I am. And so just walking around Ethiopia, people, as long as I don't talk, no one really knows. Okay, no one really knows. And so, but that also gets me into trouble because on my last trip to Ethiopia, I was walking in Addis, in Hayabu, that neighborhood where they just built a train. They were already starting the train. And this was 2013. And so I'm walking along the sidewalk, and this woman is coming towards me, and then she's very close to me, and she just starts screaming and she runs. And I'm like, okay, why is she running? And then I turn and look behind me. There's a man with a cow, a bull, no, it's a bull, because it has horns, and it's almost at me, and he's speaking to me. He's warning me, and I'm hard, but I don't know what he's saying. And so it's almost to me, and so I'm running away. And so, that got me in trouble in a certain way. And so there's so many things I want to talk about that I can't talk about. Ethiopia, I was able to travel throughout the country, north, south, central. I visited the Jamaicans in Shashamene, which is a settlement of Jamaicans who went back to Ethiopia. They grow cannabis, so I had to go and see them. And so I went there, and so I was able to really, travel through the country. One thing I think, if we have time and questions and answers, so I'm going to have to get you through these slides and wrap up, because I'm almost out of time, is maybe talking about the different, what it means to be a Westerner moving in Africa in different ways. So this is chat. This is the Bahadar and the Bolaji type. There are many, many types. And I was looking, I was like, oh, I know those. So there are many, many types. And this is a market in northern Ethiopia where I took a picture. So they're selling it. You can see a few leaves here, but most of them are behind, the people are behind the umbrellas. This is great because it shows the chat on the one billboard, and then over here to the side, there's a sign for a pharmacy. Because I'm actually working on a project on pharmaceuticals too in Ethiopia. And here's a picture of me in Ethiopia in the field. I think there's one more picture. We don't have time to talk about this at all. I was hoping we could go to other places. But this is a market in South Africa, Faraday Market, which is a traditional healing market. Because one of the things that I looked at as I was looking at these different types of drugs, pharmaceuticals and illicit drugs too, was traditional healing. So thank you.
Can I say something quickly about the cows in Ethiopia? Cows are extremely sacred in Ethiopia, and people take cows like as if they are their own, like dogs. Americans take dogs here, for example. So I remember I was in Ethiopia and I thought someone was killed, and it was actually a cow that was struck, and the entire community came. And the driver had to apologize, and of course with money and so forth, because cows are so sacred. So,
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to start by greeting you in Yoruba, and I know there are maybe about 2 people here who could respond. So I will say welcome in Yoruba, and your response is very simple. Ho. Ekabo. Oh. Right. It is fascinating that I want to talk about a Yoruba tradition that has been embraced by a group of African Americans, especially in Sheldon, South Carolina. This began way back at the end of the Black Power movement, and a group of African Americans moved from Harlem, New York, and first they went to Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, and were looking for a place to settle. But eventually they went to Sheldon, South Carolina, bought a parcel of land, and decided, to begin a Yoruba community. And the community is called Oyotunji African Village. Oyotunji is translates very loosely as a resurrected Oyo kingdom. Oyo used to be the last of the Yoruba kingdoms that flourished in West Africa from about 1600 to 1832, when it disintegrated and a lot of people got sold into this part of the world. So it is fascinating that, here a group of African Americans, decided to be purposeful, to reclaim an African identity. Barry began, our panel today talking about a myriad of ways in which, peoples of African descent choose to identify themselves here, but very rarely would you find, African Americans claiming specific ethnic groups in Africa. But here is a remarkable example that is very different. They claim a Yoruba heritage. And so I was drawn to that settlement because of my research on masking tradition amongst the Yoruba people, and I'm aware that that has survived into this part of the world. So just this past summer, Henry Drew and I spent about 10 days in Oyotunji village. So this is what you see on the road on Highway 17 on the way to Savannah, Georgia, on the outskirts of Sheldon. And once you get into the community, you find this sign drawing your attention to the fact that you are leaving the US and now entering a kingdom, a Yoruba kingdom, where they speak Yoruba language, or perhaps a version of Yoruba language, wear Yoruba clothing, just like I have on, and also, surprisingly, they eat Yoruba food, and some of them have Yoruba facial marks. This is the late Oba Adefumi who established the kingdom. He was born originally as Walter King in Michigan, and by 1959 he had gone to Cuba, and he was initiated and became a Yoruba priest. So the process of embracing Yoruba way of life had begun, but it did not crystallize until he returned to Harlem and established a temple called a Shango temple, and that subsequently morphed into what he calls, African Theological Art Ministry. And it was from Harlem that he relocated, to Sheldon in South Carolina. He died in 2005, and his son, or one of his sons, actually the 14th child, became the ruler. I don't want to go, because I don't have too much time. I will have, provided additional information about his fascinating lifestyle. But suffice it to say that he became recognized throughout the Yoruba diaspora, that in 1982, on a visit to Ife, there was a conference on Orisha worship, and he visited, and the present ruler at Ife decided to induct him as a king with his own kingdom here in the Western Hemisphere. So, first, we can say he had element of legitimacy because it was, certain kingship rights were performed, and he became a bona fide ruler of his Yoruba kingdom. So the tradition continues in his son, whom I met together with Henry Bro, and I want to show you just a few photographs of their masking tradition. But I wanted to begin with this image here, which is an image that took inspiration from the Benin head. Typically, the altar head of a past ruler that is often placed on the altar, and a lot of sacrifices are offered to the ancestor. And so this was centrally placed in the community as a way of celebrating past ancestors, those who have connections with Oyotunji village, as well as a long list of different African diaspora people that have made significant contribution. And you can see here at the back of the sculpture there are a list of several names, of important people in African diaspora. And here is the courtyard dedicated to Olokun, Yoruba goddess of the ocean. And there, the masquerade began their homage, coming from the haven. And then the first stop here, this is also the market square. And thereafter they leave here, they pay respect to, the grave of one of the women, Mamake, they call this lady, And also the late ruler, Oba Adefumin, the first king. There's a mausoleum there where they celebrate him and all the masquerades come. And thereafter, the king comes out of his private quarters together with his, his wives. And I must also say that, they practice certain elements of Yoruba culture, including having multiple spouses. And so here we have some of the maskers dancing in the courtyard. Part of the architecture of the courtyard is actually fashioned after the palace at Oyo in Nigeria. Here is a picture of one of the masquerades, and this is also yet another one. I decided to focus on Egungun in particular. There are so many other festivals that they perform every year, but because this aligns with part of what Henry, Drew and I are studying right now and trying to produce a traveling exhibition on it. So we decided to focus only on the masking traditions. This is a special one dedicated to Shango, a Yoruba god of thunder. This one here is dedicated to Oshun, Yoruba goddess of sweet waters. And this one dedicated to a generic ancestor, the Bala of the ancestor they call it, which is a celebration of people who perish in the Great Crossing, crossing the Atlantic to this part of the world. And here is yet another one in celebration of some of those. But I also discovered that each of the women also celebrates their own individual ancestors by creating new masquerades. And so they perform this, and they come out, they present the masquerade and begin to talk about their lineage history. Each of them decide to create some of these masquerades through divination. So that way they can determine their particular sub-ethnic group amongst the Yoruba people, which I thought was rather fascinating. There were masquerade types from Ijebu, masquerade types from Egba, masquerade types, from Ketu in Benin Republic, and at the end of which, the king goes back into the private quarters. And here is, pictures of, tourists stopping by to take part in the celebration. And this festival is coincided with the Memorial Day weekend, and so it attracted a lot of tourists visiting the place. At the end of the 2-week period that we spent there, the grand finale was this offering on the banks of Edisto Island at the Atlantic Ocean. And so here we all, bought all sorts of fruits, honey, salt, and what have you to offer to Olokun and indeed to the ancestors of, especially for people who perished in the Great Crossing. So I'm going to stop there so that we can have some conversation, and I'll probably just elaborate a little more. Thank you.
So what's going to happen now, we're going to break for 10 minutes. We have great food here, great African food. So I want us to taste this great food, and then we can come back for a Q&A. Let's just take a 10-minute break. So food are in the back. Try this great food, and then we're going to come back in 10 minutes.
And we can have the panelists come up first together.
Take questions or comments, but I must emphasize they need to be brief and direct. So we'll get started. Yes, please stand and identify yourself, and if you wish, direct the question.
My name is Tony D. I'm a poet and founder of Black Lives Matter in Cambridge, and to you, doctor. So I just wondered, you mentioned that there were several female pharmacies, and I just wondered what was the significance of that? I'm assuming that Senegal is patriarchal, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, there's patriarchy. Also, the literacy rate for women is actually lower than it is for men. But women, despite this, were able to really move up the ranks in terms of studying pharmacy and being able to own pharmacies. So by the end of the 20th century, women own 65% of the pharmacies in Dakar and about 50% of the country. So they're very significant in terms of their numbers in the country.
Have you sort of, how did that happen? How is it that women came to, do you have a sense of why that happened? Why women came, pharmacies particularly? Is it because of her, sort of culturally, how did that come to happen?
Well, I'm trying to make this really quick because we don't have a lot of time. We have about 20 minutes. I talk about in my book the long trajectory, but what I will say is women really started going into the pharmacy school in 1940s and 1950s, Senegalese women, because prior to that the school was there, but there were French women who were pharmacists. And so they started rising in their numbers in the 60s and 70s, and then they get higher by the end of the 20th century. One of the things is there was some discrimination in terms of admitting women to school. So women were not admitted in the numbers that men were, even if they qualified. But they tended to stay, they were retained better. So they'd be a larger, they wouldn't be the largest percentage, but a larger percentage of them would then graduate and coming in, if you will. And so in terms of owning the pharmacies, I mean, men own them too, clearly, but they really got into a lot of the organizational networks. So women became leaders in those networks and were then able to help some of the other women. There were other variables, but that's one of the main variables. Traditional healing, a lot of traditional healers in Senegal are actually men. And so that isn't necessarily a direct correlation in that way. Because women are seen as caregivers in the home, but in terms of those most esteemed traditional healers, they tend to be men.
If I may be permitted a little add-on to your question, would you comment on whether that preponderance may have a relationship to the power of market women in Senegalese society?
I didn't find that in my research, but what I will say, one of the reasons I think that they rose, one was definitely in terms of leadership. Another reason is because of the high influence of Islam. Senegal now is about 94% Muslim. And in terms of what it means culturally, if you're visiting a doctor or a healer, in terms of gender, it's often more acceptable. Women would rather go to a woman in some ways, because see, pharmacists in most of the world, they do a lot more than pharmacists here. They provide counsel, they do different things. So you just don't go and pick up your drugs. They can make some diagnoses and this sort of thing, so that's that. And then often men, particularly depending on what it is, they may want to see a woman. And so now it's become to this point, you know, by the late 20th century, moving into the 21st century, that a lot of people kind of really see pharmacists as being women. So even a male pharmacist will often hire pharmacists, assistants, or managers who are women, to help in terms of clientele.
All right. Scanning for next question. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
My name is Cynthia Becker, and I have a question for Bolaji Campbell. So I was curious about the Yoruba masquerading. How do people learn in South Carolina what to do, what kind of masks to make, and how to make it, and do they go to Nigeria to study? And then how do people learn Yoruba? Are there kids there? I didn't see any children in the photos. So are there kids, are there Yoruba schools? So just to elaborate a little bit. It's fascinating.
I'll try and answer with a mouthful. One, they learn Yoruba. They have, people on site who provide language training. But in addition to that, periodically they have connection with Yoruba people who come and actually do intensive Yoruba classes with them. Beyond that, they also, go to Nigeria as well as the Benin Republic frequently. a few of the masquerades that I showed, the Oshun ensemble, for instance, was actually bought from Nigeria, or perhaps they commissioned somebody who created that. But beyond that, they also make their own costumes. Because I spoke to a few of them who actually make them. And don't forget that some of these, glossy, lavishly published catalogs provide inspiration for them, and they use that, as resource materials. Sometimes copy things, and then also attempt to transform all of those. Yeah.
I have another question related to that, which has to do with in Nigeria and the Yoruba communities that are sort of ceremonial with the dress and the mask. Are they innovating in terms of creating based on the changes in contemporary Yoruba culture? Are they also creating new costumes, new masks, or is it very traditional? Most of them is traditional. So you were speaking to the fact that in Sheldon they were creating new costumes, new masks.
They create new masks, new costumes.
So is the same thing happening in Nigeria?
It's the same thing happening in Nigeria. The culture allows, for innovations, for ways in which people can transform traditions. And in particular, when I spoke to some of the women who were responsible for some of the costumes, they actually used upholstery fabrics, as opposed to using hand-woven textiles, or perhaps some other overseas imports. Those are with respect to the items that they create, using photographs in published catalogs as source materials. But at other times, they actually commission costumes to be made in West Africa, whether in Yoruba land or perhaps from the Republic of Benin.
You have a question? No. Okay, I'll come to you in just a moment. I'm just going to take a liberty of attaching a question here too. I'd like to ask you just a comment on the economy of the village.
The village depends solely on tourism. That is their primary source. Indeed, if they encourage people to come and stay overnight, they have little chalet where people can stay for very minimal fees. Less than $100 a day to stay there and participate in their activities. So that's one primary source.
Would you say that otherwise they're a self-sufficient economy in terms of their agricultural activity?
I think minimally, yes, they have some farms, but I don't think they raise enough, they produce enough to feed them. There is an economy that is dependent on tourism, plus maybe government subventions.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel. My question is to you also. I grew up in Lagos. So I think my question is this. Was it mainly a Yoruba history, coverage of the Yoruba history, or was it specifically to the Oyo Kingdom? Because since I saw the masquerades, I didn't see the Oyo masquerade. So that was my first question. And the second one I think is personal to me, and I've been really interested to find the answer, since you're a historian yourself. The letters, right, of probably West African, I'll probably speak where I'm from, West African, languages. So let's use Yoruba. It's Y-O-R-U-B-A. Probably with umlaut. Those are actually English letters that are probably derived from, Latin and so forth. What do you think was, I don't know if you know it, but I don't know, what is the original letters that belong to the Yoruba people, probably even the Hausas and the rest, but probably I'll ask for the Yorubas. What were the original letters?
By the time Yoruba was reduced to writing, predominantly oral culture. We don't have we don't have a tradition that is on par, with the Western world when it comes to, letters. But because it is an oral culture, a lot of information is disseminated, orally, and people was never reduced to writing. The most copious of Yoruba body of knowledge is Ifa, for instance, and you had to memorize that. It wasn't reduced into writing until the encounter with Europeans, and this began from about 1830s, 1840s, when a few Yoruba captives were forced, they were trained and they received education and subsequently sent back to Yoruba land as evangelists who began to propagate the Christian faith. The generation of first Yoruba intelligentsias were the one who created the alphabets, who created, something on par that they could use in beginning to transcribe the language. That's one aspect to your question. The second aspect is why did Oyotunji, for instance, why did they focus only on Oyo? It's quite obvious that they celebrated Oyo as perhaps the most dominant Yoruba kingdom from the 1600s through 1835, when it disintegrated, and because for them it's a conscious attempt to reclaim an African past, because some of them could identify that there were Yoruba enslaved people, who came to this part of the world, and it was important for them to reclaim that heritage. It wasn't enough to just claim to be Africans or perhaps to be Ethiopians. Virtually all black peoples were regarded as Ethiopians at a stage, in our history. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted to be more precise, and that was why they embraced, the Yoruba culture. But beyond that, by moving very close to them, I realized that they equally had affinity for Yorubas in Benin Republic, Ketu people. And that's why, I don't know if you notice, part of the name of the present ruler there is derived from Yorubas in Benin Republic, Ketu. And so they also go there every year. They have direct connections with the Alaafin of Oyo, for instance, as well as Ooni of Ife. Then the last part of your question is the form of Eyo. They don't have Eyo. You'll also notice that they don't have elaborate superstructures like we have, carved mask and all the rest of it. They have them on site, but they don't use them in the performance. They place some of those items on altars. There are a lot of shrines scattered throughout the community. All right. Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned Ife too, so I was wondering if students at Rhode Island School of Design have referenced or talked to you about the head of Ife and things like that.
If my students have spoken to me about Ife,
Yeah.
I teach Ife art as part of my introductory course to African art and architecture, and I've also done a couple of seminars even focusing on the art of the Yorubas. So a few of them who have been closer to me have been exposed, to the sheer diversity of, African art and Yorubas in particular.
If I may be permitted another little add-on question. The comments have been very much about a village that recreates Africa in the U.S.
Yes.
But in the hemisphere, there are many other populations, often dominated by Yoruba practice and tradition, that are in a more creolized or assimilated, partially assimilated posture. I'm thinking of Cuba and Brazil, and to some extent Nago in Haiti. So I wonder if you'd comment a little bit on that, on these transitional traditions.
For close on to 100 years, we had wars in Yoruba land that evidently fed into the transatlantic slave trade. Victims of, those wars were sent to this part of the world, some to Brazil, some to Cuba, a small percentage to mainland USA. But beyond that, I also think that it is because of I hasten to use the word because I'm Yoruba, to say that the culture is rich and therefore it attracts a lot of people who are interested, in the cultural traditions. You cannot distinguish, you cannot make a clear-cut distinction between what's maybe regarded as Yoruba culture or Yoruba religion. It's a very vibrant, lived experience that everything seems to be integrated together. By the time you're worshiping, you're celebrating your ancestors. All of us have ancestors. All of us have favorites, mothers, grandparents, etc. when they live. Within Yoruba culture, we perform masking. We perform egungun that celebrates them, that remembers them. And that is a cultural tradition that is attractive to people, that people can identify with. We all have, parents, favorite ones that we want to remember, we want to celebrate. And because Yoruba cultural traditions has inbuilt systems that celebrate things like that. So very easily, I can begin to convert people to Yoruba ways of life.
Scanning for another hand or question? Yes.
My name is Ndanya, and I have a question for this gentleman right here. You went to Haiti? Oh no, you went to Senegal.
I'm from Haiti.
Yeah. So I was thinking about your boat incident, and specifically how you were praying on the boat. And I'm thinking also about how I look at Facebook and I see how you have all these people like talking about worshiping Egypt, worshiping Christianity, Muslim. I don't know what the different religions were on the boat, but I'm just curious, like, was it unified in prayer? I don't know what the different religions were, but was it all unified as you were praying on the boat?
I would say yes, although all the members, except for me, were Muslim. But one of the things that, we're talking about Cynthia about this, in Senegal, you also have very strong sort of spiritual tradition in which they talk, I can't remember the word right now, in terms of ghosts and ancestry. And particularly, there is a forest outside of Tubabjalao where they are sort of in tradition. As a matter of fact, I just missed one of the largest assemblies that occurs every 30 years in Casamance, where people... Exactly, where people go and through initiation. So, in a sense, when we look at Islam, the way that Islam operates in the Middle East versus certain parts of Africa, and in particular Senegal, one of the things that we see is a kind of syncretism, right, that occurs, meaning that we could practice Islam at one level, but we also have a particular tradition that we use that ferments or at least creates a stronger bond between who I am as a Senegalese and who I am as a Senegalese was converted into Islam. So, so in a sense, and I think that's why Senegal is, relatively speaking, very peaceful, although there are, I've heard of conversation among some young Senegalese who are trying to bring a different form of caliphate, into Islam, and a lot of Senegalese are very afraid because they want for Senegal to remain kind of a Muslim/secular society, because people want to dance, people want to, enjoy a sort of good meal and so forth. So at the boat, as a Haitian, as a Voodooism, and Voodoo has a tradition from a lot of West Africa. It's a question of language. Right? They were praying in Wolof, but I knew exactly to what entities they were praying to. So for me, I was praying to Agwe, and Agwe, would be sort of all of the entities who died at sea. Right? And so it was different language, but we were there, connected in the same place. So,
Yes.
I was curious about, I've forgotten his name, of the one who created the Haitian.
Gérard Chenet.
Yes, your relative. When he created his vision, what did he bring from the Haitian culture and that vision into what got created, and has that continued?
Oh, wow.
In other words, bringing together the Haitian with the African.
Absolutely.
And how did that merge together?
Absolutely. First of all, the name is Sobo Bade.
Okay.
Okay? So he's using is Benin. Okay? It is also part of Mali as well. And Sobo is a spirit. Bade is another spirit. So calling it Sobo Bade becomes the space of admixture, kind of. And the theoretical place, he called it engouement, right? Almost like this blending. So it's at the edge of the ocean. And the first structure, as you go down towards the ocean, you have a snake railing. The railing itself is a snake. And the snake is Dambala. Okay? And then you have various statues of, Egun, Osho, and so forth, shown. And what you have is Senegalese seeing their Ndo into the statues and spaces. But also you have places where people could do yoga as well, because he spent time in India. So he's a master, he's a yogi. But what fascinated me, and when we were at the television, we were talking to one of the musicians, his philosophy is that everything has a rhythm. And so he talks about the universal vibration and the harmony within rhythms. So when you go to his place everything is geometrically space, and everything has a rhythm to it. So I simply would say, go to Senegal, go to Babjara. You would absolutely be fascinated by this man. He's 88 years old. His memory is perfect. I thought I was going to have like 1 or 2 hours interview with him. We wound up having 10 hours interview. And then he asked me, do you have any more tapes? I said to him, no, I do not. So it's absolutely fascinating.
We can take one more question. Someone who has not, oh yes, I owe you.
My question was, just like guys.
Oh, stand, please.
My name's Yada, artist, but just in general, I just had a question, like as intellectuals and scholars, have any of you been to like Timbuktu or any other like ancient universities or anything like that?
For me, going to Ethiopia, where I went to some of the old monasteries, and some of the old monasteries, one of them in particular, only male could go there, where you have very old texts, mostly the Bible, that are 900 to 2,000 years old. Again, the notion of we were illiterate, backward people going to Ethiopia, they simply just give you a different kind of perspective. And I think I'm young enough that I'm hoping to visit as many places as possible in the rest of Africa, as well as the world. But we are so connected in so many different ways that it is now giving the work that some of us are doing, are trying to really establish links of the world in general. So from the city people who are established in India and other places, you could see the interconnection of the world. And so I would say, if you could save your money instead of buying an Xbox, travel, that would be great.
I'll add a little bit more to the Ethiopia part of this, because at the beginning of the 70s, I traveled a lot in Ethiopia, several trips. I was working on an exhibition on the art of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which didn't happen because the emperor was displaced and it needed the government supports. But in the course of that, I was with Professor Ephraim Isaac, who was then at Harvard, and who is a scholar on Semitic languages and Ethiopian history, and we spent lots of time in monasteries looking at the ancient books. I was looking at the illuminations or the paintings in the books, and he could read the books, because the oldest of the books are written in Ge'ez, which is ancient Ethiopic. It's like Latin is to Italian or Spanish. It is that to Amharic. So those books covered all kinds of topics, including pharmacy, because then one day we came across a book full of medical advice and so forth. The oldest copy of the Book of Enoch in the world exists only in Ge'ez, in the Ethiopic libraries. Also in Gondar, we went to see the library of King Phasaelides, which is an old castle building there, which was the library to the king. So there is a very rich piece of work. The Timbuktu material, I really would love to go and to see, because I think it's extremely important to document that. It's also important to recognize the sense of stewardship involved in these traditions. For example, the Ethiopic material at the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum, which is where the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to be, and that stewardship is very strict. You can't go in. But if you want to see the books as I wanted to see them, I had a letter from the Patriarch, so I had a permission to see them. The priest would bring the book separately to the fence, and you could see it, and then he would take it back. And if you want to see another, he would bring another. So we don't guard our things more carefully than they guarded those things, although the questions of conservation as a scientific issue is a much graver one. Now, I think that's it for questions. And since I took the liberty of adding little questions along the way, I'll forfeit making a summary, beyond thanking our several panelists for very excellent, very rich, very inspiring presentations. And I'd like you to also give them a round of thanks.
Timbuktu, even though we're done. Timbuktu, the film, is showing for a very limited time, and it's actually showing right here, one of the theaters.
Campbell Square.
Campbell Square, yes.
Since you're on the subject of Timbuktu, I just want to remind you that a couple of years ago there was a major issue with the library in Timbuktu. And West Africa Research Association did lead a campaign of different scholars in order to preserve this rich material. So just want to point it out.
So on behalf of Africans in Boston and West African Research Association, we thank everybody for coming out tonight, giving us 2 hours of your night, and listening to our panelists. I hope you guys all learned something new and enjoyed the food. So please follow us on Facebook, and like I said, you can always give me your email address before you leave so I can update you into our system, and you can follow us with all our events or our group page, and we also have our website, africansinboston.org.
I want to add just a tiny little closing, which is to say, the museum that I direct does own a 17th century manuscript of the Miracles of Mary. If you're interested to see that material, as well as an accordion hymnal from the Ethiopian church, as we also own a mirror of Arzuni from Haiti.
Just very briefly, on behalf of Jennifer Youngwood, the executive director of West Africa Research Association, who could not be here because of medical issues, I want to thank first the panelists and the moderator for the great and very engaging talk and thought-provoking, I might add. I know, speaking for myself, that I'll be busy, processing all these great materials on my trip back home. Good stuff. And I also want to thank the audience for being here. This type of event only takes shape with your participation. I really thank for you being here. And the last but not the least, I want to thank YWCA in the person of Eva for aiding, for hosting us here. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I could only end by asking you to join me to a round of applause to all of us. And the last thing, I'm sorry that I forgot. Jennifer Yanko, the director, also gave me another task, which is to give this lifetime membership to the panelists. I understand that you are not yet, because you are already a lifetime member. So I'm going to present first to Bolaji Campbell, Dr. Bolaji Campbell. And then to Dr. Edmund.
My check. That's me. Thank you. Even though I just accepted the mayor.
We'll give it back to you.
And the last, but again not the least, to Dr. Sylvain.
Lifetime membership as a Haitian, lifetime you mean. I mean, lifetime, like when I die, I'm still gonna be.
So thank you again. So enjoy the rest of the night.